I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, as I come to you to present a lecture on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply theory. I trust you are all well as I commence the sharing of some information on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply theory as part of our central banking and monetary economics module. Without wasting time, I'm going to share my screen. So as you can see, the module is still Central Banking and Monetary Economics, CPA 5213. And the topic is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And I hope to finish a review of this theory within a short space of time. I don't expect to take long because there are no equations to derive, there are no calculations to demonstrate. It's just straightforward explanations pertaining to this macroeconomic theory. It will be your duty, after I've presented the basic outline of this theory, to fit schools of thought like monetarism, new classicalism, and so on, and new Keynesianism and neo-Keynesianism and so on. So in the short run, we know that economic activity fluctuates. If you look at the United States of America over the past 50 years, production has grown by an average of around 3% per annum. In some years, normal growth does not occur, thereby leading to a recession. In the recession, it's a period of declining real incomes and rising unemployment. You know, that's a recession where your GDP growth rate is negative. Say for 2 quarters, you've got a recession. And the depression is a severe form of a recession. And the last Great Depression occurred in the period 1929 to 1941, when output fell by 30% and unemployment rose by 25% in the United States of America. I will just pause a bit. So I was making a point when I was talking about the depression in the United States of America, that it occurred between 1929 and 1941, when output or GDP fell by 30% and the unemployment increased by 25%. So as you can see from the statistics, the depression of 1929, the Great Depression of 1929, was very severe, and it led to widespread suffering, not only in the United States of America, but in the whole world. So 3 key facts about economic fluctuations. Economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. Fluctuations in the economy are often called business cycles. We can take this aggregate demand, aggregate supply theory in its elementary form as some sort of a theory which can motivate for our understanding of business cycles, or motivate for, you know, a mathematical exposition of business cycle theory. So most macroeconomic variables fluctuate together. They tend to move. They trend upwards and downwards together. Some they trend in opposite directions, like the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. According to the Phillips curve theory, when the inflation rate is rising, the unemployment rate will be falling, especially in the short run, according to the short run Phillips curve. Most macroeconomic variables, they fluctuate together. So most macroeconomic variables that measure some type of income or production fluctuate closely together. Although many macroeconomic variables fluctuate together, they fluctuate by different amounts or by different rates. So we can see this in figure 1. Figure 1 is it's a look at the short run in the macroeconomy. Investment in the short run, as you can see, it's been increasing since 1965 up to beyond 2000 in the United States of America until it's around 1.8 trillion. Because 1,000 billion, it's actually 1 trillion. And then as output falls, unemployment rises and vice versa. So when GDP is increasing, unemployment will be falling. So during the time of a recession, unemployment rises substantially, ceteris paribus. So over time, from 1965, we see that the unemployment rate has been doing a mean reversion process. As you can see, there is some sort of mean that it is reverting to, which is around 4% of the labor force. If our statistics could be 100 years of statistics, we will see that it would be oscillating and being pulled back by certain processes that are occurring within the economy to an average unemployment rate of 4% then, or 4%. This spike around 1985, and then followed by a fall in the unemployment rate in the late 1980s. It shows that there is mean reversion that is taking place for the unemployment rate to hover at a rate of around 4%, which according to empirical evidence has been established as the natural rate of unemployment. So the short run versus the long run, we talk in terms of price flexibility. Most economists in the long run, they believe that classical theory describes the wealth in the long run, but not in the short run. Changes in the money supply affect nominal variables, but not real variables. Because in the long run, we learn that money is neutral. The so-called monetary veil is removed, and the aggregate supply curve is vertical. Prices adjust fully in the long run. But for the short run, most economists believe that prices do not adjust fully in the short run, and therefore output will change. Changes in the money supply in the short run can affect real variables. So in the short run, we don't expect money to be neutral. And the supply curve, the aggregate supply curve is actually upward sloping, ceteris paribus. Two variables are used to develop a model that analyzes short-run fluctuations. The first one is the economy's output of goods and services. And the second variable is the overall price level of the general price level, which is our GPL, which is an index of the consumer price index, or the GDP deflator. If you don't have an index of the consumer price index, you can use the GDP deflator statistics. You map them together with the economy's output or real GDP. You will come up with either a short-run aggregate supply curve or an aggregate demand curve. The basic outline of the model is that in economics, we use aggregate demand and aggregate supply in order to explain short-run fluctuations of economic activity around its long-run trend or full employment level of national income. So the aggregate demand curve is basically expected to be downward sloping, rather in shape, in terms of shape alone, not in terms of explanation. In terms of shape, rather like your individual aggregate demand curve. I mean your individual demand curve, which is also downward sloping. But the reason why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping the reasons are different from the downward slope of an individual's demand curve for a product, or even for a market's demand curve for a product. And the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, as you can see. Where the two curves intersect each other, we get equilibrium general price level and equilibrium GDP, which is equilibrium output. So the four components of aggregate demand are your household consumption expenditure, your investment spending by firms, and your government expenditure, and your net exports expenditure, which is the gap between your exports and your imports. So in figure 3, what we are seeing is the aggregate demand curve. And we are seeing that a decrease in the general price level is associated with an increase in national income from Y1 to Y2. And the AD is not downward sloping for the reasons a demand curve in microeconomics is downward sloping, which is the substitution and income effect. But in macroeconomics, the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping for these reasons: the wealth effect, In the analysis of the wealth portfolio, if the general price level falls, the value of money increases because it's like your inflation has declined. People are then holding excess cash balances, which they can either spend or lend. So that's the wealth effect. And then there is the interest rate effect, is that when they lend this money, the price level and investment. So if there are excess cash balances, these excess cash balances will cause the interest rate to decline, thereby leading to increased gross investment in the economy, which is the interest rate effect. And then we have got the exchange rate effect. When we have these excess cash balances, the result of the lending is that the general price level and net exports, the dynamics will be such that the excess cash enables the economy to boost the exports. Since there will be more investment, the economy will be able to boost the exports. At a time when imports, which are commodities produced in other countries, we assume to be constant, so net exports will increase. And net exports will be increasing because exports are actually increasing, whilst we are holding imports constant, imports from other countries constant. And our currency will appreciate whilst their currency will depreciate. And then the price level and consumption, which is the wealth effect. A decrease in the general price level increases the value of money in one's portfolio and makes consumers feel more wealthy, which in turn encourages them to spend more. The increase in consumer spending means larger quantities of goods and services which are demanded. So first, we've got a decrease in the general price level, which leads to an increase in the value of money, which leads to an increase in wealth, or nominal or real wealth, which leads to an increase in consumption expenditure, aggregate household consumption expenditure, which leads to an increase in aggregate demand. And then the price level and investment, which is the interest rate effect. A lower price level increases the value of cash holdings and wealth. People lend more. This reduces the interest rate, which is what I explained, which encourages greater expenditure on investment goods. This increase in investment means investment spending means a larger quantity of goods and services which are demanded. So first, we have got a decline in the general price level, which increases the value of money, which increases the wealth as a stock, which can be lent out, and then it increases the supply of loanable funds, which decreases the interest rate, which increases investment expenditure or cross investment. We know cross investment is a component of aggregate demand, so aggregate demand will increase. And then we've got the exchange rate effect. A lower price level increases the value of cash holdings and wealth. People are able to lend more. This reduces the interest rate. And the NCO increases the supply of dollars. The supply of dollars increases. The real exchange rate depreciates, which stimulates Zimbabwe net exports. So we know firms that are exporting, they will supply more money into the economy, and they are able to export more. They'll be able to supply more money in the economy. More money in terms of foreign currency, which will lead to the depreciation of the local currency, which in turn stimulates exports. The increase in net export spending means a larger quantity of goods and services demanded. So in terms of this summary underneath the last bullet, what it simply means is that the decrease in the general price level leads to an increase in the value of money, which increases the wealth in our portfolio, or the value of wealth, which increases the supply of loanable funds, which can be lent in the money of financial intermediaries in the money markets, which leads to a decline in the interest rate. The supply of dollars increases, and then the exchange rate depreciates. It means the foreign currency appreciates, whatever money is from outside. Net exports increase, which leads to an increase in aggregate demand. So the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve shows that a fall in the general price level raises the overall quantity of goods and services demanded. So many other factors, however, affect the quantity of goods and services demanded at any given general price level. When one of these factors changes, the aggregate demand curve shifts. One of these factors, other than the general price level, shifts arise from autonomous, not related to P or Q in the US, from autonomous factors like consumption or consumer confidence, business confidence, government spending, and so on. So a shift of the aggregate demand curve is either called a rightward shift if aggregate demand is increasing and there is more output, which is associated with the aggregate demand schedule for each and every general price level. Or it's called an upward shift when we hold output constant and we look at the general price level. The people in the economy will be willing to purchase or to demand output at a higher general price level when we are looking at the new aggregate demand curve, all other things being constant. In the long run, aggregate supply is vertical, which is the classical view. So the long run aggregate supply occurs when the economy's production of goods and services depends on its supply of labor, capital, and natural resources, and on the state of technology. Just sorting out the power here. This thing is not really charging. sorting out the power so that the machine does not switch off whilst we are working. That the machine does not switch off whilst we are working. So when you are looking at the aggregate demand, the aggregate supply curve, in the long run, it's just vertical at the natural rate of output or the natural rate of unemployment, which is 4%. At this level, an increase or decrease in the general price level does not change the natural rate of output. So when we are looking at long run aggregate supply, the level of production is also referred to as potential output or full employment level of output. So the shifts which may occur to the long run aggregate supply curve may arise from labor, capital, natural resources, and technical know-how from these markets, but not necessarily from price and other short-run related factors. So if we slot in a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, we may have the general price level at P1980, which is the general price level in 1980, hypothetically speaking, which coincides with the intersection of this long-run aggregate supply curve in 1980 and the aggregate demand curve in 1980. So if we postulate that maybe there were improvements in technology between 1980 and 1990, because we actually know that there were improvements in computer technology, the long-run aggregate supply of goods and services in the US economy actually increased from Y 1980 to Y 1990. And the aggregate demand also increased from 1980 to 1990. So if long-run aggregate supply continues to increase, we can assume that there is technological progress, which is responsible for improvements in long-run aggregate supply. Up to the 2000s, that's improvement in computer technology, especially with the advent of the internet, the information superhighway. So short-run fluctuations in output and price, the general price level, should be viewed as deviations from the continuing long-run trends. In the short run, an overall increase in the level of prices or an increase in the overall level of prices in the economy tends to raise the quantity of goods and services supplied. And a decrease in the level of prices tends to reduce the quantity of goods and services supplied in the economy. The short-run aggregate supply curve is actually upward sloping, it's not vertical. So a decrease in the general price level is associated with a reduction in the quantity of goods and services that are supplied by all the firms and the entities in the domestic economy. Why does the short-run aggregate supply curve slope upwards? To understand the upward slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve, we need to understand the expectations. If we can take, for instance, particularly expectations about prices, we remember that nominal interest rates equal the real interest rate plus the rate of inflation. We covered that in a previous topic. Borrowers and lenders must form expectations about what prices will prevail in the future before they agree to lend and borrow, so that they come up with a fair interest rate. In the macroeconomy, individuals form expectations about the general price level, and then later on, inflation, the inflation rate. Workers form expectations about prices when negotiating for nominal wages. When negotiating for nominal wages, I will correct that. When negotiating for nominal wages, businesses form expectations pertaining to prices, especially about inputs or input prices. So the shifts arise from any change in labor markets, capital markets, natural resource markets, technology, or the expected general price level, which is not the general price level per se, but actually the expectations pertaining to the general price level. So the short run, when we are looking at the long run, aggregate supply curve, a particular equilibrium point can be seen as an intersection of a particular short run aggregate supply curve and an aggregate demand curve, not as a direct intersection between the aggregate demand curve and the long run aggregate supply curve, but there will be a sort of a short run aggregate supply curve, which is implied or embedded into the analysis, like what I've illustrated in that figure 7. So the coincidental intersection of these three curves, the long run aggregate supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve, and the aggregate demand curve, yields a general equilibrium, a long run equilibrium at point A, where the equilibrium general price level occurs there and the natural rate of output is at that point. So if we postulate that there will be a decline in aggregate demand for one of the many reasons, maybe because due to a recession, then the scenario which we may have is that the equilibrium level of output in the short run will migrate. The equilibrium point will change from A to B, and the level of output will decline from Y1 to Y2, which means we've got a recessionary gap. So if the short run aggregate supply is stimulated to increase or increases on its own due to those explanations that we gave about the wealth effect and all of that stuff, operating on any one of the markets associated with the supply curve, any one of these markets that are associated with the supply curve, the markets which I covered, the labor markets, the money markets, and so on. So we're at this situation. So the equilibrium is re-established at point C, where we are now operating at a lower general price level, ceteris paribus. Whether this will be sustained into the future or not, it will depend on the stability of this equilibrium and also the likelihood of, external shocks to the system, both internal and external shocks, but more so external shocks, like a hike in the oil price due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It may cause things to shift in a certain way, and then aggregate demand may remain the same, but then short-run aggregate supply may decline by shifting upwards from AS2 to AS1, implying that the new equilibrium, which is finally established at point A, will be at a higher general price level, ceteris paribus. So in the short run, we expect aggregate demand to shift and to cause fluctuations in the economy. in terms of the output of goods and services. In the long run, shifts in aggregate demand affect just the general price level, but not output, because we will be at potential output. An adverse shift in aggregate supply is occasioned by a decrease in one of the determinants of aggregate supply, like a decrease in the stock of labor due to immigration or due to a pandemic, brain drain, and so on. So if short-run aggregate supply declines, it means it's shifting from AS1 to AS2, which causes the equilibrium point to move from point A to point B to that intermediate equilibrium point. The new equilibrium point may be established at that point, which we may call point C, but we didn't demonstrate for that. There is no demonstration for that. So the effects of shifts in aggregate supply. Number one, we have got the phenomenon which is called stagflation. Adverse shifts in aggregate supply may cause stagflation, which is a combination of recession and inflation, where you have got a decline in output, but you have got prices rising. So policymakers can influence aggregate demand, but they discover that they cannot offset both aggregate demand and the supply side of the economy in order to rectify a scenario where output is declining but prices are rising. So the correct policy responses to a recession is that the policymakers may decide to do nothing and wait for prices and wages to adjust, or take action to increase aggregate demand by using monetary and fiscal policy, as well as exchange rate and other types of policies. So when there is a shift in short-run aggregate supply from AS1 to AS2, the correct procedure is to engage in demand management policies by, say, increasing aggregate demand. But how do you increase aggregate demand? By increasing government spending, which shifts your aggregate demand curve from 81 to 82, implying that the equilibrium point will be re-established at point C, which means the previously attained level of output, which is the full employment level of output, which was attained at equilibrium point A. Once there is a disturbance or a shock which causes a recessionary gap, the economy will re-establish an equilibrium by using demand management policies at an opportunity cost of a higher general price level, because the general price level has increased from P1 to P3. So the short run versus the long run. The economy may contract or expand in the short run, but it will return to the long run level of output and the natural rate of unemployment, which is full employment national income in the long run. Aggregate supply is vertical. Shifts imply that we will return to full employment in the economy. So if we emphasize sticky wages over other theories, the slope of the supply curve pertaining to the slope of the aggregate supply curve, then we can use wage flexibility in the long run to explain how the aggregate supply curve shifts either to the left or to the right, because it will be vertical in the long run. The basic idea is that wages will adjust upwards when the actual level of output is greater than full employment level of output, which is an inflationary gap, or the unemployment rate is below the natural rate and downwards if Y the actual level of output is less than the full employment level of output, which is a recessionary gap. So if the actual level of output is greater than the full employment level of national income, it means the actual level of unemployment is smaller than the natural rate of unemployment. If that is the case, this will cause nominal wages to rise in the long run if we have a combination of these two conditions. And the aggregate supply curve will decrease or shift up and to the left. If the actual level of output is less than the full employment level of output, i.e., if we have a recessionary gap, then actual unemployment will be greater than the natural rate of unemployment, which will cause nominal wages to fall in the long run. And the aggregate supply curve will increase or shift down. Because if supply is increasing at an upward sloping curve, it will be shifting down. If it is reducing, it will be shifting up. In both cases, nominal wages will adjust until we return to the natural rate of unemployment and full employment level of output. So these other scenarios, you are going to just follow them and you try to make sense of them in the notes that I'm going to send to you. What follows is a summary of what we've been covering. Thank you so much for listening in. I'm going to email these lines to you, my MSc in Banking and Financial Economics students. Thank you so much for listening in. I believe that at least you benefited something from this first presentation.